Chapter 1. Ancient Egypt's Brewing Beginnings. Discover how the ancient Egyptians stumbled upon beer and the role it played in their daily life. Back in the days of pyramids and pharaohs, beer wasn't just a drink, it was the drink. The ancient Egyptians didn't have Starbucks, but they had something better: beer brewed from barley and often consumed by pretty much everyone: peasants, priests, and even royalty. It's wild to think that one of the oldest beverages in the world could have been so central to daily life in a society that gave us some of the greatest architectural wonders. You can almost picture it, can't you? The warm Nile breeze, the sounds of workers grinding barley and mixing grain, and the unmistakable scent of fermentation filling the air. We're talking about a place where beer wasn't just for relaxation, but a fundamental part of existence. Historians still argue whether the Egyptians consumed more beer than water on a daily basis, but let's just say they were serious about their brewing skills. Beer was considered sacred. That's right. You might think of beer as something you crack open on a Friday night, but in ancient Egypt it had divine status. Brewed in honor of the goddess Hathor, who was associated with music, love, and beer among other things, it was seen as a gift from the gods. Beer wasn't just served at banquets, it was used in sacred ceremonies, and offerings were made to the gods with it. Imagine that: a drink that could give you a spiritual connection, no less. And yes, beer wasn't just brewed for your average worker. The elite of Egyptian society had their own carefully crafted varieties made with different grains and even flavored with exotic spices. It wasn't all about casual sipping, though. Beer had practical applications too. Take the workers who built the pyramids, for example. They were paid in beer, which might sound strange, but in a society where barley was abundant, it made perfect sense. A good beer could give them the energy to work through the day under the hot Egyptian sun. So when you think about it, pyramid builders weren't just working hard. They were probably also enjoying a cold brew between shifts. Historians argue whether the quantity of beer given to workers was symbolic or truly a major part of their daily diet, but either way, it's fascinating to think of the monumental work that was done with a frosty mug in hand. There's something about this early civilization that makes you appreciate how central beer was in shaping society. It wasn't just a thing you drink to relax after a long day. It was a vital resource sustaining the body and spirit alike. And when we talk about ancient Egypt, we're not just talking about the big pyramids and pharaohs. No, beer was in the background of it all, quietly holding it all together. Chapter 2. The Brewing Process. From barley to beer, learn how ancient Egyptians turned barley into beer using surprisingly simple tools and techniques. Remember that image of the workers quenching their thirst with a frosty mug of beer while constructing the pyramids? Well, it wasn't just the workers who loved this brew. Let's take a deeper dive into how beer was made in ancient Egypt, because believe me, it wasn't just your typical throw the ingredients together and hope for the best approach. The process was both an art and a science, albeit one that didn't involve modern-day brewing equipment. Picture this: barley water and a little patience, no hops, no fancy brewing machines. But what they lacked in high-tech gadgets, they made up for with ingenuity. The Egyptians didn't know about fermentation in the way we do now, but they had a sense of what worked. Beer was made by first mashing barley to extract sugars and enzymes. It was then left to ferment naturally. But the magic happened in the mixing of ingredients. They would brew it in 2 stages. First, they would create a sort of porridge-like mixture, and then add water, fermenting it until it became a drinkable but somewhat thick concoction. No, this wasn't the golden, sparkling lager we sip today. It was cloudy, coarse, and packed a punch. The beer was often flavored with dates, which added a touch of sweetness to balance out the bitterness from the barley. In fact, the process was so basic that ancient beer was more of a meal in a cup than a simple beverage. Think of it as the original liquid bread, very thick, often consumed with a spoon rather than sipped from a glass. Historians still argue about the exact texture of the drink, but one thing's for sure, it wasn't something you down in one go. And while today's beer drinkers might think of their brews as something to wash down a burger, back then, beer was considered more of a food source than a leisure drink. It was also a pretty serious business. Brewing was done in large quantities for both the temples and the pharaoh's estates. Massive vats were used, and while we like to think of modern breweries as places of loud music and high-tech machinery, Egyptian brewers worked in relative silence. They didn't have timers or thermometers to check their brew's progress, so their expertise was based on timing and feel, a very tactile experience. Interestingly, while the majority of brewing was done by professional brewers, even women took part in the process. Archaeological evidence suggests that women were responsible for some of the early brewing practices, and some even had their own small brewing businesses. This wasn't just a job for the men, it was a family affair with women, not only making beer but serving it in temples and at festivals. And when we talk about festivals, we're talking about some seriously lively events where beer flowed freely. Some of the grandest festivals in Egypt were centered around beer. Beer wasn't just a humble daily drink, it had its place at the big table too. At these festivals, beer wasn't just for consumption, it was part of religious rituals. Priests and priestesses would prepare offerings for the gods, which included large quantities of beer. The drink was seen as a way to connect with the divine, and the gods, particularly Hathor, the goddess of beer, were believed to appreciate a good brew as much as the people did. Historians still debate how much beer the ancient Egyptians drank during these festivals and religious ceremonies. Some claim it was consumed in copious amounts, while others suggest it was more about ceremonial symbolism than actual intoxication. But one thing is clear, beer was more than just a drink. It was a bridge between the earthly and the divine. And let's not forget about the workers, the backbone of Egyptian society. Whether they were building the temples or helping with agricultural duties, beer was a vital part of their daily diet. Evidence suggests that workers received about 4 to 5 liters of beer per day, which sounds like a lot, but remember, this was their primary liquid sustenance. And for those working on monumental projects like the pyramids, that beer likely kept them energized during those long days in the sweltering sun. Now, as we explore the finer details of this ancient brewing process, it's hard not to marvel at how something so simple like barley and water could evolve into such a foundational part of a civilization. And remember, beer wasn't just a drink. It was sustenance ritual and even currency in some ways. It's a reminder that ancient societies had a far deeper relationship with their daily brews than we might think. Chapter 3: Beer as a Sacred Drink. Explore how beer was linked to the gods with rituals and offerings tied to its consumption. As we move deeper into the world of ancient Egyptian beer, let's take a closer look at how beer wasn't just a drink for the common folk, but was also deeply intertwined with the divine. It's fascinating, really. Beer was seen as a sacred substance, a gift from the gods, especially from the goddess Hathor. Hathor in Egyptian mythology wasn't just a goddess of love and music, but also the goddess of beer, fertility, and joy. Imagine the people of ancient Egypt standing before a great temple, pouring beer onto the ground as an offering to her, hoping for good harvests, bountiful celebrations, or even protection in the afterlife. It was a bond between the human and the divine, all brought together by a humble, frothy beverage. Now, beer wasn't just served up casually in these rituals. It was treated with the utmost respect. Priests and priestesses would prepare large quantities of beer to offer to the gods during grand religious festivals or temple rituals. These offerings would be presented on golden plates or in elaborately decorated vessels, as though the beer itself had to be dressed for a grand occasion. In a way, it was the ancient Egyptian equivalent of laying down a red carpet for a VIP guest. Historians argue that beer was essential in religious practices because of its perceived ability to act as a bridge to the divine. After all, if Hathor herself was the goddess of beer, What better way to honor her than to offer her favorite drink? And while beer was central to the spiritual life of the ancient Egyptians, it wasn't just about appeasing the gods, it had a social role as well. During festivals, beer was a symbol of community and unity. Large public feasts were common, and beer was consumed in enormous quantities by all participants. The people of Egypt, from the pharaohs down to the laborers, would drink and celebrate together. These gatherings where beer flowed freely were more than just a good time. They were opportunities for the entire society to come together, reaffirming their shared values, religious beliefs, and of course their loyalty to their rulers. But it's not all about feasts and festivals. The humble beer also had a practical side. Beer was used in daily life by Egyptians from all walks of life. Laborers, as we've already seen, were given beer as part of their daily rations, especially those working on the royal tombs or the Great Pyramids. The beer they drank wasn't just for refreshment, it was a crucial part of their sustenance. Beer rich in barley provided them with essential calories, helping them endure long hours under the hot sun. Historians still argue whether beer was considered a luxury item for the elite or more of a staple for everyone. What we do know is that beer's significance extended far beyond the laborers and festivals. It was woven into every fabric of Egyptian life. And this was all because beer wasn't just a drink, it was a symbol of life itself. While the pharaohs and the elite may have enjoyed refined, sweet, and stronger brews, they didn't treat beer like a mere pleasure item. It was part of their diet, too. Pharaohs had their own exclusive brews made from carefully selected grains and flavored with exotic spices. They even had special recipes for beer that would be served at royal feasts or during important ceremonies. These brews were not something you'd find on the streets. They were reserved for the highest classes, meant to impress visitors and elevate the royal lifestyle. And yet, despite these royal beers, there was a certain universality to how beer was enjoyed across Egypt. Workers, peasants, priests, and pharaohs all enjoyed beer in one form or another, and this was a testament to the drink's importance in uniting people from all levels of society. In the absence of modern conveniences like refrigeration or canned drinks, beer provided a vital connection between people, food, and rituals. The ancient Egyptians even used beer in offerings to the gods not just as a drink, but as part of a larger cultural and spiritual tapestry. So when you think about beer in ancient Egypt, it's easy to picture it as something that transcended simple enjoyment. Beer was a part of every part of life, whether you were a humble worker in the fields or a powerful ruler in your palace. From rituals to rations, it's clear that beer was more than just a drink. It was an essential part of the ancient Egyptian way of life. Chapter 4. The Role of Beer in Daily Life. From breakfast to after-work relaxation, see how beer was a staple in Egyptian diets. As we continue to explore the vast world of ancient Egyptian beer, it's time to take a closer look at how it fit into the daily lives of Egyptians from all walks of life. Beer wasn't just something you'd grab at the end of the day to unwind. No, beer in Egypt was a constant companion. It was woven into the fabric of their routine from morning to night, in ways that might make our modern coffee habits look tame. In ancient Egypt, beer wasn't just a drink, it was often considered part of a balanced diet. It wasn't unusual for the average Egyptian to drink several liters of beer a day, with some sources suggesting that the laborers, especially those building the grand tombs and pyramids, could have consumed up to 5 liters daily. But here's the kicker: beer wasn't a luxury or a sign of overindulgence, it was sustenance. With their climate as hot as it was and the hard labor they did, it made sense that beer, rich in calories and hydration, was as necessary as water. Imagine yourself walking through the dusty streets of an ancient Egyptian village, the sun beating down, and seeing workers pausing to drink their daily ration of beer. It wasn't just about quenching thirst either. Beer, in its thick, unfiltered form, provided vital nutrients like carbohydrates and proteins. And remember, this beer wasn't just what we'd consider booze today. It was more like a nourishing liquid bread, a meal in itself, if you will. Historians still argue whether beer was considered a substitute for bread in the diet of workers or if it was consumed alongside it. However, the point is clear: beer was a central part of daily life, offering both sustenance and refreshment. While we might head to a cafe for a coffee or tea, Egyptians went to their local brewer for their daily dose of beer. It was something that was both refreshing and essential, something you could drink with your breakfast or have as a mid-afternoon snack. But let's not forget that beer was also part of the social structure. It wasn't only the laborers and workers who enjoyed this drink. Beer was just as central to the higher echelons of Egyptian society, though they might have enjoyed it in a different way. The elite of ancient Egypt, the priests and the pharaohs, had access to much finer, sweeter brews. The beer made for the royal family was flavored with exotic spices and had a slightly more refined taste than what the common folk drank. Some even claim the elite had their own secret recipes crafted specifically for them and kept out of the reach of the lower classes. While the elite enjoyed their special beer for the rest of society, beer was still an important part of communal activities. During feasts and festivals, the beer would flow freely. Picture the grand banquets held in honor of the gods where beer was served in large clay vessels. There were no fancy glasses or silver goblets here. The beer was drunk straight from communal bowls, sipped in the company of friends, family, and strangers alike. And let's be honest, this didn't look like your modern-day party. No one was rushing to finish their drink. It was about sipping slowly and enjoying the moment. It was a social occasion where beer helped to cement relationships and allowed people to relax and bond. It's fascinating to think that even in the ancient world, beer had this unifying effect. Whether you were a common worker or a priest in a temple, beer was something that could bring people together. The drink in all its forms had a way of breaking down barriers and creating a sense of community. This was especially true in temples where beer was often offered as part of religious rituals. There's something quite calming about imagining a priest in the flickering light of an oil lamp pouring a ceremonial beer into a small cup, offering it to the gods, and then sharing a drink with fellow worshippers. In many ways, beer was an equalizer. No matter your rank in society, beer had a way of soothing the nerves, building relationships, and reinforcing the spiritual and cultural bonds between the people and their gods. It wasn't just a drink for the wealthy. It was a drink for everyone, from the lowest laborer to the most exalted ruler. And in that sense, beer may have been the most democratic beverage in the ancient world. Historians still debate the exact significance of beer in the social and political fabric of ancient Egypt. Was it a tool of the rulers to pacify the masses, or was it something more profound, part of a deep spiritual connection between the people and their gods? Either way, one thing's for sure: beer had an irreplaceable place in the everyday lives of the Egyptians, a place that went beyond mere thirst. It was part of their diet, their rituals, their social structure, and their connection to the divine. Chapter 5: Beer and the Workers of Egypt. Delve into how laborers, particularly those working on the pyramids, were paid in beer. So far, we've explored how beer was interwoven into the daily routines, rituals, and religious practices of ancient Egyptians. Now, let's zoom in on a group of people who might have had the most interesting relationship with beer, those who worked tirelessly to create the grand monuments we still marvel at today. Yes, I'm talking about the workers who built the great pyramids and temples of Egypt. They were given beer not just as a reward, but as a crucial part of their workday. You can almost hear the sound of shovels hitting stone, the hum of workers lifting massive stones under the relentless Egyptian sun. But if you look closely, you might notice that these workers weren't just sweating it out on an empty stomach. No, they had something that kept them going: beer, and a lot of it. In fact, they were often given large portions of beer as part of their daily rations. Historians believe the typical worker could consume up to 5 liters of beer a day while working on the pyramids. That's right, 5 liters. And no, they weren't just indulging in a casual drink after a hard day's work. They were likely drinking it while they worked. You might think that drinking beer while lifting heavy stones or chiseling away at the pyramids sounds like a recipe for disaster, but it wasn't like modern-day beer. The beer that was given to these workers was thick, more like a porridge than a liquid, and packed with nutrients. It was a high-calorie drink filled with carbohydrates, proteins, and even some vitamins. Essentially, it was a meal in itself. In a time before energy bars or modern protein shakes, beer served as a natural sustenance for the workers who needed to keep their energy up for long hours of physically demanding labor. The fascinating part is that beer wasn't just given to workers as a form of nutrition, it was also seen as a form of compensation. Imagine that being paid in beer. But don't be too quick to dismiss it as a poor form of payment. In ancient Egypt, beer was considered valuable, something that could be traded, saved, and even used as a form of currency. Workers didn't just drink beer because they had to. They drank it because it was a valuable part of their livelihood. And as much as the beer may have helped them get through the day, it also served as a form of social cohesion. It wasn't unusual for workers to gather together after a long day of labor, sharing a few mugs of beer, bonding over their collective hardships. In a way, beer was a symbol of solidarity among the workers, a reminder that they were all in this together. Historians still argue whether beer was merely a practical solution for the workers' hydration and nutritional needs, or whether it had a more symbolic role in their labor. Some suggest that beer served as a form of psychological relief, a way for workers to cope with the grueling demands of pyramid construction. After all, who wouldn't need a little cheering up while hauling giant stones? Others believe that beer was simply a cultural norm. Just as bread was a staple food for every Egyptian, so too was beer, especially for those who worked on massive state projects. But what's fascinating is the sheer volume of beer that must have been required to sustain these labor forces. Think about it, thousands of workers consuming gallons of beer each day for years on end. It's a staggering amount when you consider the scale of the pyramid construction projects. The logistics behind sourcing the barley, brewing the beer, and distributing it would have been a monumental task. The ancient Egyptians were master organizers, and providing beer for these workers was just one of the many ways they ensured their massive undertakings ran smoothly. Now let's take a moment to imagine the scene. You're a worker at the construction site of the Great Pyramid of Giza, under the scorching sun, the weight of the day's labor pulling at your muscles. But every so often you pause, take a sip of thick, refreshing beer, and feel your energy return. It's not just beer. It's your fuel, your reward, and your moment of respite. It's a drink that ties you to your fellow workers, to your culture, and to the gods themselves. Historians have long debated the question of whether beer in this context was merely a practical necessity or something deeper. Was beer used as a form of compensation, or was it part of a larger social and spiritual exchange? Some believe that beer's role in the workers' lives went beyond mere nutrition. It was a way of honoring the gods, of staying connected to the divine. In a society as complex and deeply religious as ancient Egypt, it's entirely possible that even the workers on the pyramids viewed their daily rations of beer as a form of blessing, a way of ensuring that the gods were looking after them as they toiled. So next time you sip on a cold one, think of those ancient Egyptian workers lifting massive stones, building the wonders of the world, and washing it all down with a hearty drink of beer. In a sense, it's the same beer that has stood the test of time, an enduring symbol of human ingenuity, labor, and the simple pleasure of a well-earned drink. Chapter 6. The Pharaoh's Special Brew. Uncover the beer brewed specifically for Egypt's elite and the unique ingredients involved. Now that we've explored how beer was woven into the lives of the workers and everyday Egyptians, let's turn our attention to a more exclusive side of ancient Egyptian brewing beer, brewed specifically for the pharaohs and the elite. While beer was something that could be found in every home and on every worker's lips, the high society of ancient Egypt had their own special version, a brew fit for royalty. This wasn't just any beer, it was the creme de la creme of brews crafted from the finest grains and often infused with exotic ingredients. If the common folk drank their beer for sustenance, the elite drank it for indulgence. Now, let's imagine the scene. You're a royal figure seated at a grand banquet in a palace overlooking the Nile. The walls of the hall are adorned with intricate hieroglyphs, and the air is thick with the scent of perfumes and incense. The table in front of you is laden with an abundance of foods and drinks, and there among the finest wines and rare delicacies sits the prized beer. It's not the rough, thick, porridge-like brew of the laborers, it's a refined drink, clear and golden with a smooth taste that's unlike anything you'd find in a typical Egyptian home. The beer served to the pharaohs and their elite guests was often sweeter and more carefully crafted. Unlike the hearty, nutrient-packed beer consumed by the working class, this royal brew was designed to impress. Ancient Egyptians knew how to treat their guests, and the beer they served was a reflection of that. It was often flavored with spices such as coriander, cinnamon, or even honey, making it a drink that was as much a luxury as it was a pleasure. Some even suggest that the elite had specific recipes passed down through royal families, giving them a beer that was unique to their status. But what's fascinating is how beer was still considered a communal drink, even among the elite. Despite the exclusivity of the royal brews, beer was still served in large quantities during feasts and festivals. Pharaohs, queens, priests, and high-ranking officials would gather around massive tables drinking beer together, just as the common folk did during their own celebrations. The only difference: the beer they drank was of a higher quality, possibly served in beautifully decorated vessels made of gold or precious metals. Historians still debate how the ancient Egyptian elites viewed beer in relation to their status. Was it merely a drink of pleasure, or was there more to it? Some suggest that beer played a role in the pharaoh's divine right to rule. After all, beer was closely tied to the gods, particularly Hathor, and consuming it could be seen as a way of maintaining favor with the divine. The act of drinking beer, especially in ceremonial settings, may have been a way to reinforce the pharaoh's connection to the gods and to remind his subjects of his divine status. This connection between beer and divinity wasn't just a religious notion, it also served as a political one. By controlling the production and distribution of beer, the pharaoh could ensure that his status as a god-king was reinforced in the eyes of his people. Beer was more than just a drink. It was a symbol of power, authority, and connection to the divine. When the pharaoh shared beer with his closest advisors or drank it in front of his people, it was a public display of his divinely ordained power. Interestingly, the role of beer in royal society also extended to funerary practices. In ancient Egypt, the afterlife was a major part of their spiritual belief system, and beer played a role even in death. The pharaohs in particular were buried with beer to ensure that they would have a supply in the afterlife. It wasn't just food and wine that were placed in tombs. Beer was often included in the burial offerings, ensuring that the pharaoh would continue to enjoy the divine gift of beer even in the afterlife. This belief in the continued importance of beer in the next world was so strong that beer was frequently included in tombs, sometimes in large quantities to accompany the dead on their journey. This dual role of beer, both as a symbol of divine right and as a practical tool in life and death, shows just how deeply embedded the beverage was in the royal consciousness of ancient Egypt. Beer wasn't just a drink. It was a means of connecting with the gods, reinforcing political power, and even preparing for the afterlife. For the pharaohs, beer was as much a part of their reign as their military campaigns or their architectural wonders. It was a drink that transcended the mundane and became a symbol of eternity, a symbol of divine favor. And so the beer of the Egyptian elite wasn't just an indulgence. It was a carefully crafted sacred drink that played a crucial role in both the spiritual and political life of ancient Egypt. The pharaohs may have ruled over the land, but when they drank their royal brew, They were also honoring the gods who granted them their divine right to rule. In this way, beer was more than just a drink. It was a tool of power, a means of communion with the divine, and an everlasting symbol of Egypt's rich cultural and spiritual heritage. Chapter 7. Ancient Egyptian Brewing Techniques versus Modern Day. Compare ancient brewing techniques with what we know today and how much of it remains unchanged. As we've seen, beer in ancient Egypt wasn't just a drink, it was a symbol, a tool, and a part of everyday life. But the question arises, how did these ancient Egyptians brew beer without the modern conveniences we take for granted? If you think about it, the way they brewed beer was surprisingly simple yet incredibly effective. It's fascinating to realize that despite lacking modern technology, the Egyptians were able to craft a drink that has endured for thousands of years. So let's take a deep dive into the brewing techniques used by the ancient Egyptians and just how their process might compare to the way we brew beer today. The brewing process in ancient Egypt began with barley, a grain that was abundant along the fertile banks of the Nile. Barley, of course, wasn't just used for making beer, it was a crucial part of the Egyptian diet. It was ground into flour for bread, but for beer, it was mashed into a kind of porridge-like consistency. Unlike the clean, crisp beers we enjoy today, Egyptian beer was thick and cloudy, a far cry from the perfectly filtered lagers and ales we're used to. This texture was a result of the way it was brewed. Barley was soaked, germinated, and then baked into a thick, slightly sweet bread. This bread was crumbled into a mash with water, where natural fermentation took place. While we have yeast today, the Egyptians relied on wild yeasts that floated in the air, kicking off the fermentation process. The beer they produced was essentially a liquid bread rich in carbohydrates, protein, and other nutrients. It wasn't simply brewed for flavor, it was a highly nutritious and energizing drink. As a result, ancient Egyptian beer was more of a food supplement than a recreational beverage. Unlike modern beers, which are meant to be sipped and enjoyed, Egyptian beer was meant to be consumed in large quantities, often with a spoon, as the liquid had a thick consistency. In fact, the thick meal-like texture of ancient beer likely kept people feeling full and satisfied throughout the day. It was a meal in a cup, an essential part of the diet, particularly for laborers working under the scorching sun. While modern brewing relies heavily on technology, temperature control, precise yeast strains, and advanced filtration, ancient Egyptians brewed their beer by feel and experience. Without thermometers or modern tools, their brewing process was based on a keen understanding of the materials at hand. They relied on trial and error learning to adjust their techniques over time. In fact, many of the methods they used have been lost to time, and historians still debate the exact brewing techniques used. We can only imagine how much trial, error, and experimentation went into perfecting these ancient brews. Historians also argue about whether the Egyptians used a single or double fermentation process. Some suggest that the beer underwent a primary fermentation where the grains were allowed to ferment before being diluted with water. Others believe the Egyptians might have used a second fermentation stage where the beer was left to ferment a second time to achieve a higher alcohol content. No matter the method, one thing is clear: the Egyptians had mastered a brewing process that was both practical and effective. Now let's take a moment to consider how the brewing process reflects the culture of ancient Egypt. The simplicity of their brewing process was rooted in their connection to the land and their deep respect for nature. The Egyptians didn't rely on complex machinery or artificial ingredients. Instead, they worked with what nature provided: barley water and wild yeast. In a way, the brewing process was a symbol of their relationship with the natural world, simple, harmonious, and grounded in a deep understanding of the land. While we might think of modern beer as something to be enjoyed casually in ancient Egypt, beer was an integral part of life, both practical and ceremonial. The brewing process was tied to the rhythms of daily life and the seasons. Barley, the primary ingredient, grew in abundance along the Nile, and the beer brewed from it was consumed throughout the year. It wasn't just a drink. It was an essential part of Egyptian culture, woven into every facet of life, from religious rituals to the daily sustenance of workers. Despite the lack of modern technology, the ancient Egyptians were able to create a beverage that had staying power. Their simple yet effective brewing techniques allowed them to craft a beer that not only nourished the body, but also connected people to the divine. When we think of beer today, it's easy to forget that its origins are tied to something much more profound than mere enjoyment. In ancient Egypt, beer was both a practical necessity and a spiritual symbol, and the way they brewed it, simple yet effective, was a testament to their ingenuity and respect for the land they lived on. Historians still debate the nuances of Egyptian brewing techniques. Some argue that their methods were primitive, while others suggest they were surprisingly advanced for their time. But no matter the specifics of their process, the ancient Egyptians were able to craft a drink that became a central part of their culture, a drink that sustained the workers who built the Great Pyramids, brought people together at festivals, and was offered to the gods in sacred ceremonies. In the end, it's clear that the brewing process was just as important as the drink itself. It was a blend of practical knowledge, cultural tradition, and spiritual significance. And even as we sip our modern beers today, it's important to remember that we're drinking from a tradition that stretches all the way back to ancient Egypt, where beer was far more than just a beverage. It was a vital part of the ancient Egyptian way of life. Chapter 8. Beer as Medicine. Discover how ancient Egyptians used beer as a remedy for ailments and why it worked. Now that we've explored how the ancient Egyptians crafted their beer, it's time to examine another fascinating aspect of their brewing culture: beer's role as medicine. You might be surprised to learn that beer wasn't just enjoyed for its taste or nutritional value. In ancient Egypt, beer was often used as a remedy for a variety of ailments. While we might reach for aspirin or antibiotics today, the Egyptians turned to beer as a form of healing, a trusted remedy passed down through generations. You can imagine the scene in an ancient Egyptian home. A sick person is lying in bed, perhaps suffering from a fever or digestive issues. Instead of taking modern medicine, they might be given a cup of beer brewed with specific herbs and spices. This wasn't the casual sipping beer we know today. This was medicinal beer prepared with care and intention. Beer with its barley content was thought to be soothing for the stomach, helping to ease digestive issues and promote overall health. In a time before modern pharmaceuticals, beer served as both nourishment and medicine. But it wasn't just for digestive issues that beer was used. Ancient Egyptians also believed that beer had healing properties for a variety of other ailments. Some medical texts suggest that beer was used as an ingredient in poultices or topical treatments. For instance, if someone had a wound or sore, a paste made from beer and other natural ingredients might be applied to help speed healing. Beer was also thought to help with skin conditions and promote a healthy complexion. While we may laugh at the idea of using beer as a face mask today, the ancient Egyptians believed in its soothing and restorative properties. Historians still debate the extent to which beer was truly an effective medicine in ancient Egypt. While we know that barley contains nutrients that are beneficial to health, the medicinal uses of beer were likely rooted more in tradition and belief than in scientific understanding. But that doesn't diminish the role beer played in the Egyptians' healthcare system. For them, beer wasn't just a beverage, it was a tool in the healing process, just as essential as herbs or other natural remedies. Interestingly, beer's medicinal use wasn't just confined to the home. It was also prescribed by medical professionals. In ancient Egypt, there were doctors who specialized in various fields, including those who focused on the healing properties of food and drink. These early physicians would recommend beer to their patients, often as a part of a larger treatment regimen. The use of beer as medicine was so deeply ingrained in Egyptian society that it was even mentioned in the Egyptian Book of the Dead, a key text in their belief system. The text references beer as a way to sustain the soul in the afterlife, suggesting that even in death, beer was seen as a powerful and essential substance. You might be wondering if beer's medicinal properties extended beyond Egypt. Well, the answer is yes, beer played a role in the healing traditions of other ancient cultures as well. In fact, many ancient civilizations, including the Greeks and Romans, believed in the therapeutic properties of beer. But it was in Egypt, with their deep connection to beer and brewing, that beer was most closely tied to health and wellness. It wasn't just a drink for the gods or the elite. It was something that could help the common person recover from illness and maintain good health. Historians still argue whether beer's medicinal properties were understood scientifically or if it was more about cultural beliefs. Some suggest that the Egyptians believed in the natural healing power of beer simply because it was a part of their everyday life. Beer was so essential to their culture that they likely believed it could cure whatever ailed them. On the other hand, some scholars argue that beer's health benefits were more of a placebo effect, something that people believed in because it was ingrained in their worldview. Either way, it's clear that beer was more than just a drink in ancient Egypt. It was a remedy, a sustenance, and a part of the cultural fabric. Beer wasn't just something to enjoy at a festival or offer to the gods. It was something that could heal, help, and even protect. It's amazing to think that something as simple as beer could serve so many purposes in ancient Egyptian society, from a worker's meal to a royal luxury and even a form of medicine. And let's not forget the idea of beer as a spiritual aid. In ancient Egypt, beer wasn't just a physical cure, it was also believed to have a spiritual purpose. For example, beer was thought to protect against evil spirits, and it was sometimes used in rituals to ward off illness. The connection between beer and the gods was so strong that even in times of illness, people would turn to the drink as a way to restore balance and harmony. In this way, beer wasn't just a drink. It was a bridge between the physical and spiritual worlds, a reminder that the ancient Egyptians saw their health as a divine matter linked directly to the gods. Historians still argue whether beer's role as a medicinal substance was a key factor in its widespread use, but one thing's for certain: beer was much more than a casual beverage in ancient Egypt. It was essential to the social, spiritual, and physical life of the people. It was as much a medicine as it was a meal and a ritual, and its significance cannot be underestimated. So the next time you raise a glass of beer, take a moment to remember that you're drinking from a tradition that goes back thousands of years, one that not only sustained the body but also healed it and connected the people to the gods. From its humble beginnings as a drink for workers to its sacred role in religious rituals, beer's journey through history is as rich and complex as the beverage itself. Chapter 9. The Alcoholic Element. More than just beer. Examine the importance of alcohol in ancient Egypt beyond beer and how it was consumed. By now we've explored how ancient Egyptians brewed their beer and how it played a major role in daily life, religious practices, and even medicine. But let's slow things down a bit and take a look at the broader cultural importance of beer, how it shaped Egyptian society, relationships, and social gatherings. Because if there's one thing we know for sure, it's that beer was more than just a drink. It was a powerful force that helped unite the people of ancient Egypt. Let's picture a grand Egyptian feast, shall we? The sun has just set over the Nile, casting an amber glow over the land. A grand hall is filled with the sounds of music and chatter, and at the center of it all is the large, ornate banquet table. What do you imagine is at the center of it all? Wine, maybe, but more likely it was beer flowing freely, filling large communal vessels. Beer wasn't just a casual drink at these events, it was a symbol of unity and celebration, something that transcended social classes. It didn't matter whether you were a pharaoh or a common worker. The sharing of beer at festivals and gatherings brought people together. During these events, beer wasn't just about consumption, it was about connection. It was about sharing a drink with others, engaging in communal rituals, and in a sense strengthening the ties that held Egyptian society together. You can almost picture it workers and high officials side by side drinking beer together, all united in the spirit of celebration. But let's dig a little deeper. You see, beer wasn't just for the grand feasts. It was an everyday part of social life. We've already discussed how beer was a staple in the diets of workers, but let's look at how it fit into the social structure of ancient Egypt. Beer was a drink that everyone could enjoy regardless of status. While the elite might have had a more refined version of beer, the basic drink was still the same, a thick, hearty brew made from barley and water. This accessibility meant that beer played an important role in bridging social divides. Picture a small village along the Nile. There's a market bustling with activity, and on the edges of the market there are small brewing stations where people gather to buy their daily ration of beer. Here, beer wasn't just a commodity, it was a social experience. People would stand around the brewing station chatting with one another while they waited for their beer, exchanging stories and making plans. It was an opportunity for people from different walks of life to come together and interact, even if just for a moment. Beer was a catalyst for these interactions, creating opportunities for communication and building a sense of community. Historians still argue about how beer was distributed in ancient Egypt. Was it controlled by the state, or was it produced more locally by smaller breweries? While we don't have concrete answers, it's clear that beer was an integral part of life for people at all levels of society. And while we might think of beer as something reserved for leisure or relaxation today in ancient Egypt, it was woven into the very fabric of their culture, a drink that existed not just for enjoyment, but as a social glue. As we continue to explore the role of beer in Egyptian society, it's worth considering how its significance was reflected in the festivals and religious ceremonies. These events weren't just about the beer itself, they were about what beer represented. Beer was an offering to the gods, a way to honor Hathor and other deities, and an expression of gratitude for the blessings they bestowed upon the people. But beer also played a more personal role during these ceremonies. It was part of a shared experience, something that allowed people to come together in a sacred communal space to drink, to celebrate, and to renew their bond with the divine. It's worth noting that the connection between beer and the gods wasn't just a formal religious practice, it was also something that was reflected in daily life. Beer was consumed in the home during meals and in more intimate settings. Families would gather together and drink beer just as they would share bread and other foods. It was a drink that helped foster togetherness and a sense of belonging, whether at a grand feast or around a small dinner table. There's a saying that a meal is not complete without beer, and this sentiment could easily have applied to ancient Egypt. Beer was an essential part of the diet, and it was something that brought people together in a way that few other things could. It wasn't just about the physical act of drinking. It was about sharing in the experience, building relationships, and reinforcing the bonds of community. Historians still debate whether beer's role in society was more about ritual and ceremony, or whether it was purely a practical necessity. Some suggest that beer's omnipresence in Egyptian life helped reinforce the social order, ensuring that everyone, from the lowliest laborer to the most powerful ruler, could enjoy the same drink and take part in the same rituals. Others believe that beer's role was primarily about connection, about bringing people together no matter their station, and providing a shared experience that transcended class boundaries. Regardless of how we interpret it, one thing is clear: beer was integral to ancient Egyptian society. It wasn't just a drink for the workers or the elite. It was a drink for everyone, something that brought people together in the most literal and figurative sense. Whether it was consumed as a sustenance drink, a medicinal remedy, or a ceremonial offering to the gods, beer was a central part of the ancient Egyptian experience. So next time you raise a glass, think back to those communal moments of ancient Egypt, where a simple drink could bridge divides, foster connections, and honor the divine. Beer wasn't just a drink in Egypt, it was a key to understanding their society, their relationships, and their spiritual beliefs. And just like those ancient Egyptians, we continue to gather around our drinks today, using them to connect, to celebrate, and to build lasting memories. Chapter 10. Beer's Place in Funerary Practices. Explore the fascinating connection between beer and Egypt's burial rituals. As we've seen, beer wasn't just a beverage in ancient Egypt, it was a crucial part of their spiritual life. It wasn't only a physical necessity or a social connector, it was also deeply tied to the divine. Beer wasn't just for the festivals or the daily routines of the common folk. It had a vital role in the rituals and ceremonies designed to honor the gods. This connection between beer and the divine made it a sacred drink, one that could not be consumed without understanding its deeper meaning. Now let's take a step into the spiritual realm of ancient Egypt and explore how beer was used in their funerary practices. You may be surprised to learn that beer was not just consumed during life, it also played a significant role in the afterlife. For the ancient Egyptians, life didn't end with death. Instead, they believed in an eternal journey where the soul would need sustenance to survive in the afterlife. And just as beer was an essential part of life, it was also thought to be necessary in the afterlife. It was often included in burial offerings, ensuring that the deceased would continue to enjoy it in their eternal existence. Imagine a royal tomb nestled deep within the sands of Egypt. Inside, the body of the pharaoh is laid to rest, surrounded by offerings designed to ensure a safe and prosperous journey into the next world. Among the treasures, gold and ceremonial items, there's something else: beer. Large jars of beer sealed tight were placed alongside the dead as an offering to the gods and as sustenance for the deceased. The beer wasn't just meant to be a comfort for the departed. It was a way of ensuring that the gods would provide for them in the afterlife, continuing their care long after death. What's even more fascinating is how beer was viewed in these contexts as a lifeline, not just to the afterlife, but to the divine. Beer was an offering to the gods, ensuring that the soul was cared for and protected as it journeyed through the realms of the dead. The Egyptians believed that the gods, particularly Hathor, would be pleased with their offerings of beer, and that their favor would guide the deceased toward a peaceful afterlife. Beer therefore became a sacred currency, something that connected the living with the divine even in death. It wasn't just a casual drink, it was a spiritual offering, a way to express reverence and hope for protection in the afterlife. The idea that beer could serve as both sustenance and a spiritual offering suggests how deeply the Egyptians revered their gods. Beer wasn't just something you enjoyed, it was a tool for maintaining divine favor and for ensuring a prosperous journey into the next life. Historians still debate the exact role of beer in the Egyptian afterlife. Was it purely a symbolic offering, or did the Egyptians genuinely believe that the beer would be consumed in the afterlife? Some scholars argue that the beer was intended as a symbolic representation of nourishment, while others believe it had a more practical purpose to provide the deceased with sustenance on their journey. Whatever the case may be, the presence of beer in tombs and burial offerings indicates just how deeply beer was embedded in every aspect of Egyptian life, even beyond death. And this practice wasn't limited to just the pharaohs or the elites. The average Egyptian, too, was often buried with beer as part of their funerary rites. The presence of beer in tombs and burial sites was a reflection of the widespread belief that beer had a connection to the divine and could provide protection and nourishment in the afterlife. The Egyptians didn't just believe in an afterlife, they believed in an afterlife that required preparation, and beer, along with other offerings, was part of that preparation. Now let's take a moment to reflect on how this connection between beer and the afterlife reflects the Egyptians' worldview. In many ancient cultures, death was seen as a transition, not an end. The ancient Egyptians saw the afterlife as a continuation of life where the soul would need food, drink, and protection to survive. Beer, as a vital part of daily life, was seen as essential for this journey. Its role in funerary practices was a testament to how beer was not just a mundane beverage, but something with deep spiritual significance. In the ancient Egyptian belief system, everything was connected: the physical world, the spiritual realm, and the afterlife. Beer wasn't just for the living, it was a bridge between all three realms. Whether consumed in a lively festival shared among workers or offered to the gods, beer had a sacred, multifaceted role that transcended life and death. Historians still debate the exact symbolism behind beer's inclusion in funerary practices. Was it simply a physical necessity for the journey ahead, or was it more of a symbolic act to ensure the favor of the gods? While we may never have a definitive answer, it's clear that beer held a sacred place in Egyptian culture, not just as a drink, but as a spiritual medium, a lifeline connecting the living with the divine. So next time you think about beer, remember that its role in history is much deeper than you might expect. It wasn't just about refreshing the body, it was about connecting with the divine, ensuring a prosperous afterlife, and sustaining the soul beyond death. From its humble beginnings as a drink for workers to its sacred status in the afterlife, beer was integral to ancient Egyptian society, a true symbol of life, death, and everything in between. Chapter 11. Beer and the Social Hierarchy. How beer was tied to class structure in ancient Egypt with special brews for the elite. As we continue our journey through ancient Egypt's beer culture, let's shift our focus to the fascinating ways beer was used in social and political life. While we've touched on beer as a spiritual offering and a daily necessity, it also played an important role in the lives of Egypt's rulers and their interactions with their subjects. In many ways, beer was more than just a drink. It was a tool of power, a means of communication, and a social instrument used to maintain control and reinforce Egypt's hierarchical structure. Imagine the scene: the grand halls of a palace where the pharaoh holds court. His advisors and royal officials have gathered around, sharing food, discussing matters of the state, and drinking from ceremonial vessels. Among the many drinks available, beer holds a prominent place. But this beer isn't just for pleasure, it's part of a calculated social strategy. The pharaoh, as the embodiment of divine power, is sharing beer not only to nourish his guests, but also to assert his status and maintain his authority. Beer was a drink of unity, yes, but it also served as a reminder of the pharaoh's control over the distribution of resources. The elite had access to the finest, most carefully crafted beers, while the common workers drank simpler, more basic versions. This differentiation in beer was a subtle yet powerful way of reinforcing the social hierarchy. The elites and royals were able to indulge in specially brewed beer as part of their lavish feasts, while the laborers who worked on the grand pyramids and temples were sustained with a simpler brew, yet still a vital part of their daily routine. In many ways, beer served as both a reward and a tool for the pharaoh to exert influence over his subjects. Workers were paid in beer not just as a form of compensation, but as a form of control. Providing beer as a daily ration helped to maintain the labor force, ensuring that workers were motivated and able to continue their grueling work. But it wasn't just the working class who benefited from beer's role in Egypt's political system. Pharaohs and priests would also use beer as part of their larger strategy to solidify their divine status and maintain loyalty from their subjects. The pharaoh's control over beer wasn't limited to just the production and distribution of the drink, it was also tied to the larger economy. Beer was part of the taxation system, with large quantities of it being produced and collected as tribute from the various regions of Egypt. The beer produced by the state was not only used for ceremonial purposes and distributed to workers, but also served as a form of currency. In some ways, beer functioned as an early form of economic exchange, an item that could be traded for goods and services. In this sense, beer was both a symbolic and economic tool for the rulers of ancient Egypt. Historians still argue about the extent to which beer was used as a political tool in ancient Egypt. Some suggest that the distribution of beer helped maintain the loyalty of the lower classes, while others believe it was merely a practical necessity for the large workforce that built the pharaoh's grand monuments. However, one thing is clear: beer wasn't just a casual drink. It was an integral part of Egypt's social and political machinery. While beer was used to maintain power and control in ancient Egypt, it was also a symbol of the interconnectedness of all classes. Even though the beer consumed by the workers was different from what the pharaohs drank, both groups relied on beer for sustenance, and both were united by its role in their society. This shared connection, albeit through different forms of beer, helped create a cohesive social structure where even the humblest worker could partake in the same essential drink as the rulers themselves, albeit in a different form. And let's not forget the ceremonial aspect of beer in the royal courts. The drinking of beer was a formalized part of rituals, whether for celebrating a military victory, marking a royal birthday, or offering thanks to the gods. The pharaoh's sharing of beer with his court was a public display of his divine authority, and it reinforced the idea that the ruler was not just a leader, but a god on earth. In these ceremonial moments, the sharing of beer wasn't just about quenching thirst. It was about reinforcing the connection between the rulers and the divine. Beer was also present in the religious practices that tied Egypt's leadership to the gods. The pharaoh was believed to be the earthly representative of the gods, and by consuming beer in ceremonial settings, he affirmed his divine status and his ability to commune with the gods. Whether he was offering beer in a temple or drinking it during a royal feast, beer was a way for the pharaoh to demonstrate his connection to the divine, strengthening his rule and reassuring the people that their leader was indeed divinely chosen. Historians still debate the significance of these ceremonial beer rituals. Was it simply a display of luxury and power, or was it a deeply ingrained religious practice that tied the ruler to the gods? Regardless, what is undeniable is that beer played a significant role in the performance of political and social power in ancient Egypt. It wasn't just a drink. It was a tool of governance, a symbol of divine favor, and a vital element of Egypt's vast social and political network. So next time you crack open a cold one, think about how beer once served as a tool of power in one of the most ancient and powerful civilizations on Earth. Whether it was shared in the royal courts or consumed by laborers working on the pyramids, beer was far more than just a drink. It was a symbol of unity, a vital currency, and a powerful force in maintaining Egypt's social and political order. Chapter 12. Historians disagree. Was beer truly essential? Unpack the ongoing debate about how central beer really was in ancient Egyptian society. As we've seen, beer wasn't just a drink in ancient Egypt, it was a profound symbol of unity, power, and spirituality. But what about its role in Egypt's interactions with the outside world? As one of the earliest global civilizations, Egypt's culture, including its brewing techniques and love of beer, spread far beyond the Nile. Ancient Egyptians were great traders and explorers, and through their extensive networks, beer made its way along trade routes that connected Egypt with regions as far away as Mesopotamia, India, and beyond. It's fascinating to consider how beer, something so fundamental to Egyptian life, might have crossed borders and influenced cultures that were thousands of miles away. Let's imagine the bustling Egyptian port cities where merchants from distant lands dock their ships. The air is thick with the smell of spices and the hum of trade, and alongside the fine fabrics, metals, and grains that Egypt traded, something else is being passed along the routes: beer. Egyptian beer, thick and hearty, was part of the goods being exchanged, and it wasn't just consumed in Egypt. Over time, beer began to make its way to other parts of the ancient world, from the Mediterranean to Mesopotamia. While beer had existed in some form in these regions, the Egyptian variety had unique qualities that made it stand out. What's fascinating about beer's spread is that it didn't just show up as a commodity, it became part of cultural exchanges. Egyptians weren't just trading beer. They were introducing people to the idea of brewing on a larger scale. Many historians suggest that the techniques Egyptians used to brew beer particularly the use of barley, had a significant influence on other brewing traditions. The Egyptians had perfected the use of barley as the primary ingredient in beer, a practice that would eventually spread to other cultures, including the Greeks and Romans. But beer wasn't just traded for economic reasons, it was also a part of diplomatic exchanges. Picture this: Egyptian ambassadors and envoys meeting with foreign dignitaries, perhaps in the palaces of Mesopotamia or Persia, and sharing the very same beer that had been crafted along the banks of the Nile. This wasn't just an exchange of goods, it was an exchange of culture. Beer, in this sense, was part of a larger effort to build connections, establish trade networks, and assert Egyptian influence on the world stage. Historians still debate how important beer was as a trade commodity compared to other goods like grain papyrus or gold. Some argue that beer wasn't nearly as significant as these items, while others suggest that beer, especially high-quality varieties, played a role in diplomatic gifts and festivals, particularly in regions that didn't yet have a strong brewing tradition. Whatever the case, it's clear that beer had a unique position within Egypt's broader trade networks. It wasn't just a drink, it was a cultural ambassador helping to strengthen Egypt's international relationships. And let's not forget that beer wasn't just consumed in the royal courts of Egypt or the homes of workers. Beer was also a staple for the soldiers who protected Egypt's borders and participated in military campaigns. Just like workers on the pyramids, soldiers were often given beer as part of their rations. The idea was that beer helped to keep the soldiers healthy and fortified, ensuring they had the strength to face the challenges of warfare. But beyond that, beer also had a social function among the soldiers. After a long day of marching or battle, soldiers would gather around their campfires, sharing mugs of beer to bond and relax before facing the next day's challenges. Beer became part of their routine, a comfort and a unifier. Beer also made its way along Egypt's military campaigns. As the Egyptian armies expanded their influence, they brought with them not only weapons, but their cultural practices, including beer brewing. It's likely that the regions where the Egyptians conquered or established military presence began to adopt brewing techniques and develop their own versions of Egyptian-style beer. As Egypt's reach expanded, so too did the presence of their beloved brew, ensuring that the influence of Egyptian beer spread across a vast territory. As Egypt's beer culture traveled beyond its borders, it met with the brewing traditions of other cultures. In Mesopotamia, the Sumerians were already brewing their own form of beer, but they had a completely different approach, using a more primitive form of fermentation. The Egyptians, with their more refined techniques, brought new knowledge to these neighboring civilizations. The Egyptians' knowledge of barley-based brewing was particularly impactful, and it's believed to have influenced beer-making traditions in Greece and Rome civilizations that would go on to spread their own versions of beer throughout Europe and beyond. Historians still argue about the extent of Egyptian influence on these brewing traditions. While we know that beer was already being brewed in other parts of the ancient world, the Egyptians' advanced techniques and use of barley undoubtedly played a role in shaping the brewing practices that followed. Whether the Egyptians were directly responsible for introducing new brewing techniques, or whether they simply helped to refine and spread existing practices, it's clear that beer was one of the many cultural gifts Egypt passed on to the world. The spread of beer along trade routes didn't just help Egypt's economy. It also facilitated cultural exchange, bringing people from different lands together. Beer became a universal symbol of hospitality and shared experiences transcending borders and connecting diverse cultures. And this exchange wasn't just about beer, it was a part of the larger exchange of ideas, technologies, and traditions that took place across the ancient world. So next time you raise your glass, think about the long journey that beer has taken. It started in ancient Egypt, where it was crafted for sustenance, spirituality, and social connection. But as Egypt traded with the wider world, beer became a symbol of their influence, a cultural bridge that helped unite people across regions. From the banks of the Nile to the farthest corners of the ancient world, beer was more than just a drink. It was an ambassador carrying Egypt's legacy across the ages. Chapter 13. Trade Beer and the Silk Road. Learn how Egyptian beer spread along trade routes and its surprising global influence. As we've seen, beer's journey from the heart of ancient Egypt to distant lands was just one part of its rich history. But what about the types of beer that have been lost to time? We often think of beer as a simple universal beverage. But just like with many other aspects of ancient Egyptian life, the varieties of beer brewed during that time were diverse and sophisticated. Unfortunately, many of these ancient brews have been forgotten, lost to the sands of time. But through the writings of the ancient Egyptians themselves and archaeological discoveries, we've been able to piece together some of the flavors and varieties they might have enjoyed. Let's take a look at these forgotten beers and what we can imagine about their taste and significance. Picture yourself walking into an ancient Egyptian brewery, a small, buzzing space where barley is being ground and mash pots are bubbling. As the brewer works, he carefully selects grains, mixes them with water, and adjusts the fermentation process. It's not just one type of beer being brewed here. The Egyptians were sophisticated in their beer making, creating different kinds based on the ingredients, the brewing methods, and even the social or ceremonial purpose of the beer. Some beers were brewed to be thicker and more porridge-like, ideal for workers to drink during their labor, while others were crafted to be lighter and more refined, suited for feasts or offerings to the gods. Historians still argue about the specific recipes used by the Egyptians to make their beer. Some believe that different regions within Egypt had their own variations of beer based on local ingredients and brewing practices. Others suggest that the Egyptians brewed a range of beers for specific social classes, each with its own unique flavor profile. For instance, the beer consumed by the common people was likely hearty and full-bodied, made from simple ingredients like barley water and wild yeast. This beer would have been thick with a substantial texture and probably had a very earthy flavor with hints of the grains and perhaps some sweetness from added dates. On the other hand, the beer brewed for the pharaohs and the elite was likely a more refined product. These beers would have been brewed using the finest ingredients and possibly flavored with exotic spices such as coriander, cinnamon, and honey. Some ancient texts even mention that the pharaohs had their own special recipes for beer brews that were rich and flavorful, designed to impress visitors and royalty alike. These beers were probably much more similar to the modern beers we enjoy today, though still distinct in their own right. But what about the varieties that we'll never taste? We know that some beers, particularly the ones brewed for religious or ceremonial purposes, were crafted with rare ingredients and might have had special significance. Some of the ingredients used to brew these beers are now lost to history. For example, it's likely that the ancient Egyptians used a variety of herbs and plants that no longer exist in the modern world, or that have become rare over time. These unique ingredients would have given the beer distinctive flavors, ones that we can only guess at today. If only we could taste what beer brewed for the gods might have been like. The funerary beer placed in tombs to accompany the deceased into the afterlife was another kind of brew. This beer was likely brewed for its sacred significance, designed not just to nourish, but to protect the soul in its journey. The beer was probably thick and hearty, ensuring that the soul of the departed would have a satisfying and nurturing drink to sustain them in the afterlife. Archaeological evidence suggests that the beer placed in tombs wasn't just a practical offering. It was an essential part of the burial rituals tied directly to the Egyptians' beliefs in the afterlife. What's interesting about these ancient beers is that they weren't just beverages, they were part of a larger cultural system deeply tied to the social, religious, and political fabric of Egypt. These forgotten beers were as much about symbolism as they were about taste. They were used to honor the gods, to nourish workers, and to build social bonds. The varieties of beer, then, were more than just different styles. They were reflections of the times of the people and of the world they inhabited. While we may never be able to taste these lost beers, their legacy lives on. The ancient Egyptians' commitment to their craft has shaped the way beer is brewed and consumed today. The techniques and ingredients they used helped form the foundation for the brewing practices that would spread across the ancient world and eventually evolve into the beers we enjoy now. And perhaps in some way, the essence of those forgotten beers lives on in every bottle and glass of beer that's poured today, a subtle link to a long-forgotten past. Historians still debate the precise ingredients and brewing methods used to create these lost varieties of Egyptian beer. Some suggest that the ancient texts hint at more complex recipes, while others believe that the Egyptians might have stuck to simpler ingredients, focusing more on the process than on the complexity of flavors. But one thing is clear: beer in ancient Egypt wasn't just a basic drink. It was a sophisticated, multifaceted beverage that played an important role in Egyptian society, culture, and spirituality. As we continue to enjoy our modern beers, it's worth remembering that we're not just drinking a beverage, we're participating in a long and rich tradition that stretches back thousands of years. The ancient Egyptians were the pioneers of brewing, and their beers, now lost to time, laid the foundation for the beer we drink today. And while we might not be able to recreate those original brews, the essence of Egyptian beer still echoes through every sip we take. Chapter 14: Egypt's Forgotten Beer Varieties. Take a look at the ancient beer varieties that history has almost forgotten but were once beloved. As we come to the final stretch of our journey through the ancient world of Egyptian beer, let's take a moment to reflect on its lasting impact, not just on Egypt itself, but on the world at large. From humble beginnings to a sacred offering to the gods, beer in ancient Egypt was an integral part of their society. But what happened to this incredible legacy? How did the brewing traditions of ancient Egypt evolve, and how did they influence the cultures that followed? The fascinating journey of Egyptian beer didn't stop at the borders of the Nile. It spread across time and space, leaving traces that can still be seen today in the way beer is enjoyed around the world. Imagine standing on the banks of the Nile watching as Egyptian merchants and traders prepare to set sail. They're not just carrying grain, papyrus, or gold. Among their prized goods is the famous Egyptian beer, now sought after by people in faraway lands. As Egypt's trade routes expanded, so did its cultural influence, and that included beer. The techniques, ingredients, and styles of Egyptian brewing became part of the larger global trade. And though the specifics of ancient Egyptian beer may have been lost to time, the influence of Egyptian brewing methods traveled along the Silk Road, reaching far-flung regions and giving birth to new brewing traditions. By the time the Greeks and Romans came into the picture, beer was already an established part of life in the Mediterranean world. However, their brewing practices were influenced by Egyptian methods, particularly their use of barley as the primary ingredient. Greek and Roman beer, though slightly different in style, reflected many of the same principles that the Egyptians had perfected millennia earlier. And just as beer was central to Egyptian society, it would eventually become an integral part of Roman feasts, often consumed in large quantities at banquets and gatherings. As centuries passed, beer continued to spread across Europe, evolving with local ingredients and cultural preferences. The brewing techniques that originated in ancient Egypt would be modified, refined, and passed on to future generations. The methods used in ancient Egypt laid the groundwork for the beer that would be brewed in Europe during the medieval period, and later the modern beers we know today. In this sense, ancient Egyptian beer wasn't just a product of its time, it was a precursor to the entire global beer industry. But beyond its role in trade and cultural exchange, beer also had an impact on the way we understand and experience social gatherings. In ancient Egypt, as we've seen, beer was about connection. It was consumed not just to quench thirst, but to bring people together. Whether shared among workers, consumed during religious rituals, or passed between friends at a festival, beer was an essential part of building and maintaining social bonds. This tradition of communal drinking has endured, and today beer is still a central part of many social occasions. From small gatherings at home to large festivals around the world, beer continues to be a symbol of unity and camaraderie. Historians still debate the direct link between ancient Egyptian brewing and modern beer traditions, but there is little doubt that the foundations laid by the Egyptians influenced the brewing world in ways that have reverberated through the ages. Some argue that beer's role in ancient Egypt was more about sustenance and spirituality than recreation, while others believe that beer's social significance played a larger role than we might think. However, whether as a sacred offering to the gods or a simple, nourishing drink for the laborers, beer's influence on ancient Egypt's social fabric cannot be overstated. And let's not forget that the Egyptian love for beer wasn't just about the drink itself, it was about the culture surrounding it. Beer wasn't just something to drink. It was something to celebrate, to offer to the gods, and to share with others. This celebratory aspect of beer drinking carried through the centuries, evolving with each new culture that adopted it. Even today, beer continues to play a central role in celebrations, from toasts at weddings to the cheers at sports events. The tradition of raising a glass and sharing a drink with others is a direct descendant of the communal beer drinking rituals that began in ancient Egypt. In many ways, the journey of Egyptian beer mirrors the journey of human civilization itself. It began as a simple, practical drink used for nourishment and spiritual connection. Over time, it became something much more, an integral part of cultural exchange, social bonding, and celebration. And though the specifics of ancient Egyptian beer may remain a mystery, its legacy lives on in every beer we drink today. Whether it's the rich, hearty stouts of Europe, the pale ales of England, or the craft beers of modern America, the roots of beer can be traced back to the banks of the Nile, where it was first brewed to nourish and connect people. So the next time you crack open a cold one, take a moment to think back to those ancient brews of Egypt. Though they might have been thick and earthy with grains that aren't common today, the spirit of the drink, the camaraderie, the celebration, the spirituality lives on. Beer isn't just a drink. It's a bridge to the past, connecting us to an ancient civilization that valued its role in both the earthly and the divine. And as we enjoy our modern beers, we're continuing a tradition that stretches back thousands of years, one that unites us just as it did for the people of ancient Egypt. Chapter 15. The Legacy of Egyptian Brewing. Conclude with the lasting impact ancient Egyptian brewing has had on modern beer culture. As we reach the final chapter of our journey through ancient Egypt's beer culture, it's time to slow things down and reflect on the incredible legacy left by the Egyptians. From their first discovery of barley-based brewing to the sacred rituals surrounding the drink beer was an integral part of Egyptian life. But as with everything in history, the story of Egyptian beer doesn't have a clean, definitive end. It is a part of a larger story, one that stretches across time, continents, and civilizations. In many ways, the history of beer mirrors the story of human progress itself. Just as ancient Egyptian beer gave way to Greek and Roman brews, and those in turn influenced the development of modern beer, it is a testament to the way ideas, cultures, and practices evolve and shape one another. The Egyptians didn't just create beer, they created a drink that would transcend millennia and become a part of every culture that followed. But it's not just about the beer itself. The story of Egyptian beer is really the story of a civilization that understood the importance of community ritual and the sacredness of daily life. Beer wasn't just a drink, it was a way of honoring the gods, nourishing the body, and connecting with one another. It was consumed during grand festivals, used in religious rituals, and shared at the end of a long day by workers in the fields. The ancient Egyptians understood that beer was more than a beverage, it was a symbol of life itself, tying them to the land, to the divine, and to each other. Historians still argue about the specifics of ancient Egyptian brewing methods and the exact role that beer played in their society. But what's undeniable is that beer was as central to their culture as anything else. It was the drink that nourished the laborers who built the pyramids, the elixir offered to the gods in sacred temples, and the beverage shared among friends and family. It was in many ways a perfect symbol of Egypt's complex and vibrant society, a drink that transcended class culture and even death. As we reflect on this journey, we can't help but wonder how the ancient Egyptians would view beer today. Would they recognize the golden ales and dark stouts we sip from modern glasses as their own creation? Perhaps they'd be surprised by the variety of beers we have today and the sophisticated brewing techniques we've developed. But in some ways, they'd feel right at home, for beer, at its core, is still the same, a drink meant to be shared, enjoyed, and celebrated. And as we look back at the incredible story of Egyptian beer, it's important to remember that it wasn't just the drink itself that mattered, it was the ways in which it brought people together. Beer was the common thread that wove through Egyptian society, connecting gods and mortals, workers and rulers, the living and the dead. It was as much about the ritual and the community as it was about the taste. In a way, beer was a bridge that crossed not only between different parts of Egyptian society, but also between life and death, the earthly and the divine. So as we bring this story to a close, let's take a moment to raise a glass, not just to the ancient Egyptians, but to the timeless connection we all share through this simple drink. The next time you take a sip, remember that you are participating in a tradition that goes back thousands of years to the banks of the Nile, where beer was first brewed for the gods and the people. Now, as the story of Egyptian beer fades into history, we can rest knowing that we continue to carry forward that ancient tradition, drinking not just to quench our thirst, but to connect with the past, with each other, and with the generations that will come after us. So let's ease into the quiet, the sounds of the world outside softening as we reflect on this journey. Beer isn't just a drink, it's a part of our shared humanity, stretching across time and cultures, from the ancient Egyptians to the modern world. And in that quiet space, may we all find a little peace as we share in the story of beer, the drink that has in its own way stood the test of time.